So this is the first Religion Media Centre briefing of this new term, if you like, and it's a great day as power shifts in the government, and we're waiting for pictures in the background to see Liz Truss go in and see the Queen and for her to become officially the next Prime Minister. And of course, she faces an inbox of epic proportions with soaring energy costs, inflation, fears of hunger, people dying of cold this winter, the NHS in crisis with long waiting lists, and a war in Ukraine, to name just some of the things that she has to deal with first off. And we're going to be reflecting on the situation in the country that she finds herself facing, and on the work of faith communities and the message of faith groups to the government on the priorities that they believe the government should have and what it should do first. So our guests today are Pastor Mick Fleming from Church on the Street in Burnley, Daniel Singleton, the National Executive Director of Faith Action, Laura Marks, an interfaith consultant at Common Good, the Rev Joanne Thorns from the northeast of England, and Gareth McNab, who will be joining us a bit later, the Director of External Affairs for Christians Against Poverty. So Daniel, perhaps I could start with you first of all. So Faith Action represents a network of faith organisations across the country. I have to ask you first of all, this is the Faith Partnerships Week. Did you know that this particular week, when you set it out, you would be facing a change of government in the process as well?
Oh, I'd love to say we did know, but no, we didn't. And we thought, we've been trying to pull an event together actually really since Easter, particularly focus on the Keeping the Faith report that Chris Baker's pulled together, working alongside our colleagues. We were trying to pin down Michael Gove and Kimmy Baynock and all that kind of stuff, but it wasn't happening, and we can now understand why. We're really pleased to be joined by Paul Scully tomorrow, who's the faith minister at Dulac. But no, we realised that there was an opportunity, this 2-week gap effectively when Parliament comes back before the party conferences. I have been advised that you should never ever do events in that period of time, but there you go. And we're just pleased, Ruth, that you and your colleagues have picked up on Faith in Partnership Week, which maybe will become a thing. I don't know, we'll see. We've got 3 great reports to talk about this week.
Well, you've got lots of events happening. What are you trying to say in the course of the week? Why have you organised this special week with lots of events? What's your message?
We've had a number of things just come together, really, and in that sense, we often, one of the catchphrases we like to talk about, which is that faith is the first in and the last out, and initially, after a quiet approach or a lack of approach from government at the start of the COVID crisis, we saw local government and the national government really have to get involved and connect with faith organisations to reach people, whether it was food packages, whether it was visitation, whether it was medicine delivery. And we saw those partnerships happening. And for many people in different local areas, there's a regular connection, whether it be with food banks, whether it be with debt counselling or different social action things. So we saw those things going along well-worn lines, and we saw partnership happening. But part of the problem is actually just getting that in people's minds. Now, I think we got some great images of the Sikh community feeding lorry drivers trapped in Dover. And then there was this kind of retreating after COVID. But then we have the Afghan crisis, the Ukrainian crisis, and suddenly we've got to come back to faith groups again. And partly what we're saying is that faith is not just for crisis. We need to build in. And I think in terms of the Build Back Better or the levelling up agenda, if we don't engage with faith organisations as a country, we will not have the social infrastructure and if you like, the faith infrastructure to build up on.
So with the new government coming in from today, who are you going to see first, and what's your first message to whoever it is that you see?
Well, I've not had a call yet from number 10 to pop in for a drinks reception. It's not. Maybe Laura has, or I can see Mick's probably on the call. He's ready to get down. So I've not had a call yet. I'm obviously very keen to meet. As I say, we've got Paul Scully, MP, coming in. He's the relatively newly minted faith minister at Dulac. We hope he will still be in place by the time of our event, but we'll see what happens there. And it'll be interesting to hear what he has to say. I would say it's interesting. I don't know if you spotted, but the Faith New Deal funding suddenly seemed to get a spurge and move on after ministers disappeared from their posts. I think things have been agreed. And it's interesting to see that some of those relationships, maybe with civil servants, are already in place. And I'm hoping that we'll see some things go on there. We've certainly had a renewed connection with DCMS, Department of Communities, Media and Sport, as they're looking at volunteering. And I'm hoping that there is now a general recognition across government that it's good to work with faith, and it's not just shoved off into one department or one corner. So I'm ready, sitting by my phone, Ruth, ready for anyone to call and to see what we can do.
Thanks. And I know that many people on the call will be at the event tomorrow, and we will be there reporting on what happens as well. Can I just bring in now Pastor Mick Fleming? Mick, you became very well known to all of us by that film that was made by the BBC in, I think, the first COVID lockdown, where you were followed around in your van around the streets of Burnley as you were giving out food and essential supplies and dealing with really desperate people on the streets. In fact, your church is Church on the Streets, isn't it, in Burnley? Can you just tell us how the situation has changed? Is it still as desperate in Burnley as it was in 2020?
It's worse and progressing. I think the difference is during the pandemic, if we want to call it, and bill it that way, is that there was a willingness for ordinary people to give. They had money themselves. So some business people, the payments and things like that, and they couldn't spend the money. So they were giving more freely. The difference now is the level of poverty is worse, but the level of giving is less because people are afraid. I think what we've done successfully is talking about partnerships so we've worked really hard. And so in our church, we have the NHS, we have the mental health teams that work out of here. We have a clinic that works out of here. We have drug and alcohol services, homeless services. They work out of a church, but from a perspective of faith, so it doesn't interrupt our notion of faith and our notion of giving and what have you. So politically, it looks different. It kind of like we're working so closely with the secular because they've had to come to where the people are, where the people who are struggling, and they have. And so the response is, it looks very different. So if we say an average Sunday service looks different because the professionals that came in to support and help end up coming to church. We have people from all different religions that turn up at church on a Sunday. The dynamic is really changed, which is a positive thing. The partnerships are really positive, and that's kind of facilitating a lot of change in the community. The problems that we're seeing is that because of the lack of resource, and traditionally, for me, what I see, this is just from my perspective, is it's been a trickle-down economy. It's been, you kind of feed the top, pour water in at the top, and it runs down to the bottom. Now what's happening is there's nothing at the bottom, and in the history of the world, I've never seen anything grow from the sky down. So for me, we need investment at the lowest level. We're seeing a new kind of poverty. So I've seen and picked up mothers and children off the street homeless. What we're seeing is people can't actually afford to pay the top up on the rents, the housing benefit rents, so they're becoming more homeless. I've just managed to procure an electric wheelchair. Check this out, for somebody who's street homeless. The vulnerable, not just the addicted community, the physically and mentally vulnerable in society, we're always well looked after. Those days are gone, I'm afraid. And we're seeing more and more vulnerable people sleeping rough, living rough. The basic needs of people are not being met. So people struggle for food, they're struggling for warmth, they're struggling for accommodation, and it's getting worse and worse. So I'm starting to see the pension poor. arriving in our facility en masse. And also, sadly, I'm starting to see the working poor. So the working poor being people that the last week of the month, they can't afford to get to work because they don't have enough money, so they can't afford the bus fare. So we're supplying bus tickets to get people to work, so food parcels. So this is kind of what my worry is, and the conversations I'm having is that, and I mean this seriously, I'm not mega educated or anything, but I'm being really serious when I say that. This is that we need to have a spiritual revolution, because that's much preferred than a bloody revolution, because we're going to see crime rising, we're going to see antisocial behaviour, we're going to see more drugs, and that just all leads to a spillage out onto the street, whatever you want to call that, just rising crime or whatever. So we're trying to push a spiritual revolution, and and that's why faith is so important. So for me, it's to be who's God. So my faith would say Jesus, and it's honesty, unselfishness, purity, and love. That's what God is, and that's the way that we need to follow. And you can really call that what you want, call it Dave, I don't really care. But that is what's required to facilitate change. And I'd like to see that injected into politics and bottom-up innovation, not top-down. And that shouldn't matter what your political leaning is. It should say, for this time, in this crisis, in this moment, that's what's required. And party politics should be irrelevant. And I think how I've described faith there is what's needed. It's what's needed to facilitate change and to bring a bit of peace and compassion to the situations that people are going to find themselves in.
So when you see Liz Truss become the Prime Minister today, are you saying that you're not convinced that any politicians have been listening or hearing things, or if they have been listening, haven't been doing anything? And what you're looking for Liz Truss to do is to show that she gets it, she understands. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, basically, I don't think it's a cost of living crisis. I don't think it's a heating crisis or a fuel crisis. I think it's a greed. I think that's what it is, and it's not allowing a fairer distribution of what's required for basic needs. I'm not talking about amassing wealth. I'm talking about for basic need. And I don't think the politicians have been listening, because they're holding on to systems that are broken, and they're trying to fix things with broken tools. It's time to look at what we need to do. Whether you're left wing, right wing, down the middle, it should not matter. I mean, what is the right way? What's the right thing to do for the people of this country to facilitate change around poverty, around hunger, around heating, around the fuel, and all the rest of it? What's the right thing to do? And they quiver in the boots if you said, oh, maybe nationalise. Oh, we can't say that. We can't even think that way. Well, what about They're not prepared to look at alternatives. And I think that's what worries me. We need a kind of consensus of common sense, a coming together of common sense, not party politics. The days of party politics at the moment should be rubbed out, wiped out, and thrown down the drain. We need to come together and have a coalition of common sense. And I don't see that we've got that. Where there's competition, it's going to destroy. It's not going to be a breeding ground for success, not when you're talking about poverty, because genuine poverty is unequal access. And when you've got equal access, you're no longer poor. So the things we're talking about, the partnerships with the NHS that we're involved with, so we have the mental health teams, the physical health teams, and things like that. When you're involved in that, you're giving people access, so they're no longer poor. So we have a food bank, and it's not massive. We do what we can. We struggle to get food. But if you're part of this community that we're in, you'll never go hungry again for the rest of your life, because you're part of this community. Now, I'm not saying run the government like we run the church, but what I'm saying is give it a look and say, what's that about? Why does that work on a smaller level? And I think, invest in small local organisations rather than en masse and just dropping money on people and expecting them to know what to do with it, because they
Thank
don't.
you, Mick. Yeah, I'm sure there'll be questions to you from the other journalists on the call a bit later, but could I bring in perhaps some of the other speakers? So Joanne, perhaps next, from the northeast of England, and the obvious question is, are you experiencing the same level of distress that Mick has just described in Burnley?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, some of the recent figures around child poverty has put the Northeast as one of the highest levels of child poverty in the country. And we are just seeing huge impacts on that in our schools. You know, when schools are spending, I'm a school governor, so I understand what happens. And when they're spending huge amounts of their time trying to work out how to get food parcels to children who are coming in hungry, where every member of staff is making sure they've got clothes and underwear and, you know, period products for the girls, just as a standard practice, so that they can actually enter education. That's not an acceptable place to be for one of the wealthiest countries in the world. So we are seeing huge levels of poverty. We had a conversation with a gentleman the other day who was talking about what's going to happen, and he's turned his fridge off. He'd gone to the food bank and he only wants tins because he's turned his fridge off because he thinks he can't afford to pay for the electricity on the fridge. So therefore he can't access a whole raft of food that would have gone in his fridge. And actually he's looking at things that he can eat cold out of the tin because he doesn't want to turn his oven or his gas on to actually heat a tin of beans. You know, that's just not an acceptable level for this country. And those stories are echoed throughout the Northeast, as I'm sure they are in the rest of the country. I think it is critical the government has conversations with us to find out some of those stories, because we have been plugging the gap for so long. And I actually need to stop. We need to keep continuing the plugging the gap, but actually they also need to be at the table to have some conversations about how you, as Mick has said, about how you actually look at the situation differently and find a different way forward.
So is that the priority? Your priority is that the government should sit down with you? I'm amazed actually that you're saying that. The government hasn't been sitting down with you. No ministers, no local MPs have been sitting with you.
We work quite well with some of the local authorities. But no, we haven't really had any of those conversations. I mean, I speak to the Northeast, and I'm sure some from the Northwest would say the same. Sometimes it feels like we're completely forgotten about, if we're honest. We're just this place at the top of the country that everybody ignores.
So what's the first thing that Liz Truss should do you think?
He needs to listen. Really listen and find out what's happening, and not come in with set agendas where the decisions have already been made about policies that have always been carried forward, and actually listen and to be open to different policies to try and look at different ways forward. You know, we haven't even mentioned things like the housing crisis and the fact that so many people can't find housing. Mick mentioned, you know, how many people are homeless. That level is becoming very huge, and maybe not on the streets as in some places obvious, but sofa surfing, young kids coming out who are basically having to sofa surf around friends and neighbours because they cannot afford accommodation and their jobs are really low paid.
It's a massive inbox. I mean, just listening to you and Mick. Can I just bring in Laura Marks at this point? Laura, you have founded charities, and you are now with the Common Good. Perhaps you could explain a little bit in the course of this what that does. But just listening to those stories of deprivation in the Northwest and the Northeast, does any of that surprise you?
Well, of course, none of it surprises me, and it's hugely depressing. And as you say, Liz Truss's inbox is heaving and piled high, and the stories we've heard already this morning from Pastor Mick and Joanne, you know, are enough to break your heart. And I don't want to say much more about that, because I think that you have expressed it so well and so in so much detail and from so much personal experience that I think maybe I would like to move on to talk about some of the other things that I would be saying to Liz Truss.
Okay. Well, it was an answer, as a question to everyone. What should she do first? What's your list? What's your wish list?
Okay, so obviously, you know, as I say, the sorts of issues that we've heard about must be top of the priority, because how has our country reached this state? But I think that actually what I would say to Ms. Truss is she needs to have a mindset which is about understanding the faith communities. I think that that's where she needs to start. She needs to understand that we are big. You know, we may not be as big as we used to be, but when you add in all sorts of people who are involved in spiritual living or have all sorts of other sets of beliefs which may not be traditional faith communities, the people who conform to some sort of religious or faith community is huge. And not only that, when you listen to what Pastor Mick and Joanne in particular have been talking about, our communities are integral to the running of this country. So whether it's food banks, or it's looking after refugees, or it's taking care of children, or it's coffee mornings, or it's youth groups, or you name it, the faith groups are integral to this stuff. And I think that Liz Truss needs to understand, I would encourage you to understand quite how influential and quite how important the faith communities are to the infrastructure of Britain today. And that particularly in this time of crisis, there's an opportunity to work with the faith communities to deal with some of the issues going on, or not, depending on how she goes about it. I think a second issue I would want to talk to her is about women and the role of women in the faith communities, because it's so easy to simplistically say, which is true, that pretty much all the faith communities are patriarchal and that they're historically patriarchal and that women have difficult roles with them. But the women are actually the ones who are running most of the stuff that I was talking about. The women are the ones who are looking after the refugees, and they're making sure that the children have got winter coats. And I don't know how much, Pastor Mick, they're involved in your community, but I bet there's a load of women out there on the streets and being involved day to day in this stuff. And it's very easy to exclude the women in the faith communities are often the ones who are targeted as well. So Tell Mama, for example, which does work with Muslim women or Muslim people, has identified how overzealously Muslim women are targeted, for example, on buses. Women are busy being targeted, they are excluded from the conversation, and yet they're integral to the faith communities. And it's lovely to have a woman prime minister. You know, don't think we should underestimate that. And I hope that she can see the issues with a fresh pair of eyes as a woman and get involved in some of that. I tell you about an event this week, which I won't name and shame, but it was in government, central government. We sent as Nisan Hashim, which is one of my charities, which to your question, Ruth, come together under the title of Common Good. So Nisan Hashim is a network of Jewish and Muslim women. Julie Sadiq is here today, who founded it with me, actually. But at this meeting, which was a meeting of about 15 faith leaders, there was only one woman. And that was the woman we sent along from Nisan Hashim. And how do we expect to solve the problems of the world if we're excluding so many of the population from the meetings? So that's a job for her. Another thing I would ask her to do is to understand that the faith communities feel hard done by. They feel excluded, they feel minimized, they feel pushed to the fringes. And I put it that there are 9 protected characteristics, and faith is the runt of them all. It's the one you don't take to work. You know, you increasingly, you can take your disabilities, you can take your gender, you can take all sorts of other characteristics to work, but take your faith, I'm not sure, it's a bit embarrassing, it's a bit uncomfortable, particularly as there's a tendency for people to think of people of faith, whatever that means, as either extremists or do-gooders, neither of which really sum up who we are. So I would say, don't exclude us. We're not all extreme. We're actually mostly in the middle, and we're mostly people who are contributing hugely to society.
Laura, could I ask you, do you think that women really will be her priority if there are people who are kind of in wheelchairs living on the streets?
I'm not saying that women need to have the priority above anybody else, but I'm saying listen to the women. Listen to the women of the faith communities, because they are often at the grassroots of solving the problems. That's what I'm saying. Get them around the table and hear what they've got to say and hear how they can help.
So do you think it matters that the Prime Minister is a woman? Do you think it's more likely?
I don't know. I can only hope. So, some women are very good at pulling other women along with them. Some women are less good at it. I think more important than her being a woman, actually, is that she does her homework and that she doesn't make mistakes. So 2 weeks ago, she made a mistake, and it was a mistake which was very something that most people wouldn't have noticed, but that those finely tuned would. So what she did was she said that she talked about how Jews are good at business, and she talked about how Jews are good at conservative family values. Now, what's so interesting, particularly about the business one, is that that's what I would call positive anti-Semitism. So it's taking a trope that exists, that Jews do business and Jews make money and Jews blah, blah about money, and it's seeing it in a positive way. But it's not a positive, to put it like that, because it reinforces stereotypes. And you can see it in any faith community where people use something that is a stereotype, which is not helpful. No stereotypes are helpful. They think they're using it positively. She was using it in a interview with the Jewish Chronicle. She was trying to say how much she admired the Jewish community, but actually she slipped on a banana skin. And banana skins are everywhere for politicians. Another really good example, which wasn't Liz Truss, but lots of politicians have done it, is when they go to visit Jesus' house. And a couple of politicians recently have been to visit Jesus' house, which is a big, positive, powerful Black church community, which I'm sure everybody knows. And they've got caught up in the issues around LGBT plus issues and so on. These things are complex. These things are not easy to do. Don't get into the banana skins, avoid them, because once the politicians start tripping up and start saying the wrong things about faith communities, which is so easy to do, then I think it's really hard for them to have credibility within the faith communities.
Thank you. Can I return to Pastor Mick now? Mick, you were saying that you think that this is a crisis of, if you like, motivation, really. That if people were motivated to address the problems that you see on the streets, things would change in a way that they're not changing at the moment. How can you make that happen within government? How do you make the people who haven't been listening to you, the ministers, the Prime Minister, listen to you? What are you going to do?
So what I'm going to do, if you're asking me personally, is I'm going to carry on doing what I'm doing. I'm going to speak the truth and I'm going to serve the poor. So I think what happens is we see a lot of community leaders and a lot of politicians, not all, that they don't understand what service is. So you can put a hand out and pull somebody up, or you can get underneath them and lift them up. There's a big difference. And people don't want a handout. I don't want to be like somebody else. If I'm in trouble, I need somebody to lift me up, to be like who I am, but the best version of me. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to serve the people that need serving. And I think the best leaders are the best servants. And we don't see too many politicians that serve. I haven't seen them. Seen one or two. But that's the difference. That's kind of a different kind of political message. It's either serve or be served.
Is it something to do with the background of the people who are MPs and in government? I mean, your story is where you tell your story, but you were transformed. Is the problem that ministers and MPs have never had to face the issues that you're talking about on the streets?
So I'm reluctant to say that, but I think there is a place in politics for lived experience. Well, not all lived experience, because if I try to create a society that's just like me, that's just a reflection of my own ego, and that's just ridiculous. So you need both. You need you need lived experience, but you also need other experience. I mean, I'm not a great academic, but we need good academics. We need good thinkers. We need lots of different things, but that shouldn't, in my opinion, when we're in crisis, be related to your political affiliation. So we need, I believe, politically, we need a coalition of common sense to pull us through and out of the current situation. And I think the politicians are sadly locked into themselves, their own parties, their own fears, their own anxieties, and they won't do it. But I think that is what is required.
Daniel, coming to you, you speak to politicians all the time. How do you make them listen? And how will you make Liz Truss and the new government listen?
It's very interesting hearing some of what Laura was saying about banana skins, and although I'd be unwise ever to disagree with Laura, I do feel there is a sense that we as the public or as the voters need to be somewhat more generous with people that are, in the end, are only human. And I think there is a need to recognise, and part of what I found myself doing, just to be honest with you, is actually just trying to be a friend, a point of connection. And I found more politicians, more leaders generally talk to me about personal loneliness, particular difficulties that we all face, and that kind of thing. They're not unhuman in that sense. And I think, in terms of what Mick's saying, that common sense, I think we need to have a greater sense of generosity to allow people to have a go. One of the challenges I think we have to face is that actually in the past, particularly within the UK, talking about Christian churches because of the length of time, we've seen Cadbury was a firm set up to help people. Even Guinness was set up to facilitate people to actually create wealth. I think there's a challenge to be saying it's not just about food banks and debt advice and trying to deal with the resources we have. I think there's a thing of how can we in faith organisations work together to create wealth, and I think that's an interesting challenge in itself. And I think how that works, how that works, what role we can play, and realising that actually there is probably not great magic wands to wave. But if we're looking to really rebuild society and give equal weight, we need to see some wealth creation kick off, and we need some experimentation in that sense. Now, I'm a teacher by profession. I'm not, I've always kind of been in the public sector, so I'm not a great innovator in that sense. But I tell you what, I'd love to get behind some people who are. And I think that sense of permission, that sense of risk-taking is, and of course what Mick went out and did was risk-taking. He did something a bit different. And we got behind that, we saw that on our TV screens. And I think that's one thing I'd like to see more, a little bit more of, I'm not talking about a cavalier approach. I'm talking about actually realizing that we need some permission to go out there and to make some difference, and actually try to I suppose I want politicians not to be so worried about banana skins, but to be having a bit more of a have a go mentality. Boris got away with a lot because he did flounder on things, and in the end it got him. But there's more room. There's more room for operation, I think.
I mean, it just seems like two steps removed from where the need is at the moment, Daniel. Encouraging people to be risk takers and innovate and create businesses, when Mick and Joanne have been talking about people switching off fridges, sofa surfing, being in wheelchairs on the streets, mothering children picked up on the pavement. I mean,
I think that could be how you see it. But let me give you an innovation that I'm thinking of. I don't know how this energy crisis will go. I've got a son who's going off to university up to the northeast. Joanne, I'll put him in touch with you. So there's going to be a spare room in my house. There's a double room. I'm thinking, actually, if there's someone I know within my, who's less well off than I am, that actually we start to make that a warm place. I know there's going to be a whole new program related to a warm welcome come out of faith communities. I think more to be said on that in coming weeks. But it's that kind of innovation I'm talking about. What are the things I've got that I can share and connect around, and that kind of thing? And I think that the relational, connected social network, social capital thing is something that we can make much more out of. We have often places of worship, but they're buildings that we own that can be are owned and can be used. That's the kind of classic thing. But I think far more powerful is the relational connections. I think what we have in terms of commitment to one another. In my family, I don't always like my family, but I do have to choose to love them. And I think it's the same within our churches, within our mosques. There is a commitment that goes deeper than blood. And there's a loyalty and connection, and actually I think we can see that, and I think it's how we flip that capital to start to do things. But as I said, Ruth, I'm not an entrepreneur in the classic sense. So
well, you might be in charity terms there, so it depends how you define it. But Gareth McNab has joined us now from Christians Against Poverty, and I'd just like to bring you in, Gareth, obviously to ask you what's the priority for the government to do day one, but also I'm quite struck in the conversation so far. No one has said spend X amount of £1 billion on this, or cut energy bills by this amount. No, there's a lot of ideas about changing attitudes, understanding the problem, but no specific policies from anyone yet. Do you have a specific demand from the government immediately when Liz Truss becomes Prime Minister?
Great questions, Ruth. Thanks for letting me join late, with apologies to others if I repeat something that somebody has said and suggest that I think it's a great idea. Please hear that as a compliment to you if you've already said it, not me trying to claim any credit. So what should the Prime Minister's priorities be? We undertook some work as Christians Against Poverty through the summer in terms of planning our policy priorities and how we would describe them if Rishi won or if Liz won. And we understood the key difference to be that Rishi Sunak is a very pragmatic politician, would tend to focus on fiscal responsibility, making cuts to the size of the state in order to balance the books, and that Liz Truss would be prepared to take a little bit more risk with the growth agenda, growing the economy, because a rising tide rises all boats. And I don't have a particular beef with either ideology, except you always have to have, as I think as Christians, I think faith communities everywhere would say, that's great, but what about the poor? That's great, but what about when that idea just doesn't work? And so here we have Prime Minister Liz Truss, and we have an aim at a growth agenda and investing in things to take away barriers to growth and increase incentives to growth of our overall economy. And this is where I sympathise as a policy wonk, as a faith leader. I sympathise that she's just got a totally different job to me and has to balance many more competing priorities than I do. But my job is to make her understand that the needs of people on low incomes in the UK today must feature in her priorities. And you must not ignore the needs of low income households. You cannot grow the economy and focus on, I'm doing good if GDP goes up, if our gross domestic product has gone up, but we're still working out how to feed hungry children, how on earth can schools keep doing the providing clean uniforms and a bit of breakfast when they can't afford to pay their energy bills and keep teachers on. The idea that civil society can leak into the gaps where our shared society is falling apart and begins to crumble. And I think it begins to expose this idea that government should only focus on the things that government should focus on, and the rest of us have to mop up the pieces. I think it is the church's joy to meet immediate needs in local communities. I think it's a witness to the love of Jesus. I think it's a long heritage we have. The church is older than the state, and we do wrong if we don't meet a need that we could meet. But if we don't also raise our voices to challenge why we're needed, why on earth are we needing to open our doors this winter to help people stay warm, when our Creator's endowment of human beings with dignity and agency and power over their own lives, that was robbed in the fall, but is restored to them again in Jesus Christ? That's the society that I'm agitating for, where, yes, I love that brothers and sisters are prepared to open their buildings, that Christians Against Poverty are supporting the Warm Welcome Hubs with input and encouraging it around our networks. If you have the means to help somebody stay warm and welcome this winter and you don't do it, then shame on you. But if in 2-3 years' time we're still relying on that to help our neighbours stay warm and connected to other humans in the winter, then shame on all of us for allowing that to continue. So we meet immediate needs, and we challenge the way society works, or rather it doesn't work for people on low incomes who keep getting beaten down by the powerful. That's not okay to me.
Right, thanks. And bringing in Joanne, you've just mentioned something in the chat box there. Would you like to ask the new PM, does it understand about the faith groups filling the gaps?
Yeah, and I think that echoes some of the things that Gareth just said, really, that, you know, things like food banks have become the norm and the expected. And therefore that we're not asking the questions. We shouldn't be still having food banks. And that whole concept of how much the faith groups are just consistently doing that, picking up the pieces without those questions being answered or asked about this is not acceptable in today's world. We should not have to have that. And I think many churches will come in and sort out warm hubs and drop-ins and things like that. But I worry that they will then become the norm in 3 years' time, in the same way that food banks have become the norm. And that again is not what we're asking, what we want. We want a system where people do not have to feel so desperate that they are coming and asking for food parcels and heating, and, you know, we have to fix that situation.
So there's a question for you and Mick probably in the chat box here. Well, how are you going to provide that if churches and other organisations providing food banks and so forth and warm hubs, they too are facing a rise in prices? Now, we don't know what is going to be announced on Thursday regarding energy bills, but until now, there's been a great fear that churches are going to be, and all faith groups that open their doors will be clobbered like everybody else with rising energy prices and therefore unable to fill the gap. And I wonder, Joanne and Mick, if you've considered that in your groups and what your response has been.
Absolutely. A number of our churches and our regular places where these things happen, food banks, centres, are all asking the question. Many of them are on business tariffs. So actually the energy prices already have hit them. They're not waiting for October because they weren't under the price cap. They were on business tariffs. They have already seen the increase in prices, and there are lots of questions about how that is going to work, where the funding is going to come from, who's going to do that. And of course, we are still working with a system where post-COVID, many of our regular volunteers have not been able to go back, and there are sort of many questions around the volunteer status and training and where the volunteers are going to come from as well. But yeah, critical cost wise, absolutely, totally critical.
But I kind of think a little bit different. So my thinking is that as we support people and help people, we don't support people to stay where they are, and I'll just be wasting my time. So we find out the true nature of what somebody's suffering with, the type of poverty, the spiritual, the mental, and we serve into that situation. And that generates his own income. And I just think, when I look at the economy, and I feel like, so the government's built like a dam right across the river, and the water were flowing and we could dip in freely at one time. But now what's happened is the dam that's built across the river, the water there just stagnates and rots, and it's not fit for drinking. And I think that's kind of what's happened. So the idea of the work we're doing is to keep the water flowing. So we new innovations and ways to generate income, and working with the secular organisations and charging them, you know, so that we can serve in our church in a Christian manner. It's not kind of a business model. It's how do we feed the poor, but how do we get the poor to feed other poor? So if I know where the water is and somebody's thirsty, I've just got to show them where it is so they can drink it themselves. So it's not to keep people trapped. The financial implications are to help people out of the situation so they can help other people. And that has to be an economic, and that's the economics that we're trying to practice. But there is fear around where the money's going to come from. But we do have plans. We've got plans in place to combat it the best that we can.
Ruth, okay to raise another point around the support that the faith communities are giving to the crisis going on in society, which is Then I think that the opportunities there, we talked a bit about volunteerism, always been mentioned, and the challenges of how you fund all of the infrastructure needed for all of this civil society work to go on. But I think there's another piece here, which is around the faith communities working more closely together. And I think that this is something that the Prime Minister or whoever she puts in place to work in this arena, and hopefully she will put somebody who cares about this in place, to think about how, rather than playing the faith communities off against each other, which is very easy to do, how she actually brings us together to work more closely. And I thought it was very interesting during COVID, because as somebody mentioned, the Minister for Faith set up all sorts of round tables, and there was a very, very lively engagement with government for each of the faith communities, but not much bringing the different faith communities together. And on issues like this, there's no difference between us in terms of what we believe. This is where you can really unite the faith communities together around poverty, around the crisis that we're going to see this autumn, in the same way as we could all come together around COVID. And I think there's an opportunity here for the new government to work on policies or systems or structures or funding, which brings us specifically together to work on these things, because we could do so much better if we did it together.
We've been talking, of course, mainly about the priorities to do with vulnerable people and poverty and so forth, but someone's just put in the chat box, what about the specific issues facing faith groups like Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and so forth? I mean, Laura, perhaps you're best placed to answer this. Are there specific policies or concerns that the Prime Minister needs to address, specifically affecting faith groups?
I think that as the world becomes more divided, and the cost of living crisis, or whatever we want to call it, this autumn is going to divide us even further. We're always looking for scapegoats, and it's classic that you're looking for somebody to blame. And very often the people we blame are the faith communities or the underdogs or the minorities. And obviously, as somebody Jewish, then I've got a very sort of finely tuned or finely honed experience of this or understanding of this. But I also see it very, very clearly with the Muslim communities, where people are very much targeted for being Muslim or for being thought to be Muslim, not even necessarily for being Muslim. And I think that as we move into this autumn and things get more and more difficult, there will be an increasing tendency to turn on the minorities. It just always happens. And so I think that I would encourage the new Prime Minister to really think about this. And part of that is not playing the communities off against each other. And I think we have seen that in recent years, where communities have felt, there's a thing that I call the religion pain Olympics. Every community thinks they're the most hard done by government. And I think it's true not only in the faith communities, but it's very apparent in the faith communities. And to find ways to focus on the similarities, which includes prejudice and hatred, because each group, particularly the minority groups, all feel it, and how to focus on the things that bring us together without ignoring the things that make us different. So I think that this is going to be a really big issue this winter. And I think the growth of the far right is going to be something very frightening that we really all should be thinking about, because the far right are particularly focused on the minority faith communities and particularly focused on the women.
Thank you. And now we've widened out the agenda a little bit. Can I bring Joanne back in again? Because Joanne, you have been working in the North East with areas of deprivation, but now you have a particular role to do with refugees and asylum seekers. So again, the same question, what do you want the government to do? What's the priority there?
I mean, I think we all know that there's a crisis there, and the press, you talk about scapegoating people, etc. That happens a lot with asylum seekers and refugees and migrants. But the system is just simply broken, and it really needs a massive overhaul and a rethink. whether we're working with asylum seekers who have been here for years and we need to look at settling their status, whether we're looking at those who've got no recourse to public funds and are literally destitute and can't find homes, whether we're looking at the thousands that are still in hotels, which, you know, from an economic point of view are costing a lot of money to support, whether, you know, there is a whole raft of things. We've got Ukrainian families who, you know, coming to the end of the first 6 months, many of whom are looking for housing and may become homeless and are presenting homeless at the local authorities. So there's a huge issue around how we support people coming to this country because they need to flee, they're needing support, and we don't other them and make them the problem, which is quite often what tends to happen. I'm sorry for journalists being here, but some of the press do that quite a lot. But it needs a complete, I'd really urge somebody to sit down and really rethink the system.
Would that involve abandoning the Rwanda policy?
Oh, absolutely, yes. Absolutely.
So I feel the next question to all of you is, what hope do you have for the next government? All these wish lists that you've outlined and the expectations that you have, what hope do you have that there will be change? Joanne, any hope?
Yes, yeah, I do, because I think fundamentally, as human beings, whatever our faith is, or even if we have no faith, we are fundamentally creatures of God, and we are fundamentally good people. And I think the majority of politicians that I've worked with and spoke to become politicians because they want to do good, because they want to change things. I may not agree with what they might want to change, but they fundamentally want to change. And I would hope that we can move away from sort of the whole party politics and, you know, setting one against the other, to work together for a coalition of common sense and just begin to think about how we work better together as faith groups, as politicians, and look to help those who need it most and create a better, more cohesive society. And yes, I do have hope for that. I think we can do that.
Yes, I think the hope for me, I do have hope, because I think there is change coming, because they won't have any choice. They won't have any choice but to change, because things are going to get worse and worse and worse. And one way or another, things will change for the better, because they'll have to. We're in a very painful time in our history, I think. And if history teaches anything, it's that change is definitely going to come. And I pray for a spiritual change, not a bloody change. And I think that's where the direction that we're moving in.
I'm going to bring in a colleague of mine, Christopher Lamb, now, who has a journalist perspective on hope, I think.
Without being cynical, does anyone seriously think that Liz Truss is going to work with faith communities? I mean, we've seen time and again, with Boris Johnson's government and Liz Truss's government, and we can expect her to follow in his footsteps. But I don't think they're serious. It's a populist government. Populist governments are in permanent campaign mode. They're not really interested in governing. Surely the best that faith groups can hope for is to work together at the grassroots level, regardless of what the central government is doing, following in the example of Pastor Mick, who's putting faith into action. That surely has to be the way forward, rather than expecting Liz Truss and this government to do anything. I think that is a pipe dream to think that they're going to do anything.
I think it's really powerful challenge, Christopher. And I would go back to what I said earlier in terms of, look, if you can do good in your local community and choose not to, you're wrong. And if that is all you're doing and you are not joining your voices with those who are being discriminated against, marginalized and oppressed by our society and state, then you're also wrong. Now, I don't know necessarily that my hope is that I'll be able to change Liz Truss's mind, but I do want to be a faithful representation of my faith. I want to represent Jesus and his church well, who stood against injustice. They feed the poor, absolutely, but then you challenge the structures. The example out of my faith text in Acts, when the church was feeding the widows, but there was a racist tension within the group that meant that one group of Jewish women weren't getting fed and another group were being preferred. And that systemic injustice was challenged and corrected by the church to make sure there was good provision for all. We've got to meet immediate needs and challenge systemic injustice if we're to truly demonstrate the fullness of our faith, at least the faith I understand best, the Christian faith that I have.
Thanks, Gareth. I think, Daniel, perhaps if I could ask you to, sorry, Laura, I don't think we're going to have time to come to you, but just ask Daniel to wrap up, because this is your territory. And is Christopher right to say, that it's a pipe dream to expect that the government will work with faith groups? What do you think?
I think that, well, history has shown us that there is some opportunities, and pragmatism does in the end kind of come through. And I think if we look past the immediate ruptures we feel, which could go on for a long time, being the energy crisis, the issue in Ukraine, but then look at the promises that this government made, and it's still on their manifesto around levelling up. If the Conservative Party want to wrap up those red wall voters, they have to do something. And I just don't think that there is sufficient social infrastructure outside of faith to be able to deal with. You can deal with the sexy cities of, I don't know, Manchester and Birmingham, but how about those second level cities? I live not far from Dagenham. Dagenham, a post kind of industrial. We're talking the similarities of those things. So actually, it's the faith communities that are already there to connect with. And I think we've already seen that everyone overlooks the faith communities until the crisis kicks in. So crisis, I think, is an opportunity for renewal. In 2014, Birmingham signed the first faith covenant, which is part of what we're looking at in terms of partnership. And when I spoke to the lead counsel at the time, who himself was an atheist, not a person who's a believer in faith, I said, John, why are you doing this? We're off mic, we're away. And he said to me, we've got to mobilize everyone. And I think partly the pragmatism and the need to engage, as well as the fact that it's good to, I think we've established it's good to engage and good to have partnership, but the need to do it will actually drive. And as long as we keep doing some of the things that Gareth and Mick and Joanne and Laura have said, there'll be no denying that actually faith communities should have a place. And I think it's, we need to avoid some of the banana skins, not worry about some of the others, and show there's a way to go through with partnership. I think that will make a difference. Right. I think if the Tories want to hang on to power, they're going to have to work with faith. Thank you.
I think that's quite a good moment to say perhaps we all ought to regroup in about 3 months' time and see if anything's happened and have the discussion all over again. So thank you to everyone taking part. But before you all go, I'd just like to introduce my colleague Sorcha. I don't know if you want to be visible on the link, Sorcha. But it was just, we've got a lecture coming up. We'd like you to put it in your diary on Tuesday, September the 20th. Professor Linda Woodhead from King's College London at St Bride's, the Journalist Church, Fleet Street, on religion, the future. And this is all associated with the census results that are going to come out a bit later in the autumn, showing how many people tick the box Christian, how many people tick the box non-religion, and showing the way that things have changed over the last 10 years or so. So there's a link there in the chat box. So my duty is done, Sorcha. I've advertised the lecture. Please all get a ticket. But it was really good to have another Zoom, wasn't it, after all that break? And great to see you all again. And do stay in touch with us. And I don't know what we're going to do next week, but watch this space anyway. Thank you. All the best as we're glued to our screens.